Um, Hello and welcome, everybody. A very warm welcome to everybody who has joined us today, the third day of Kurlavarki Design Forum. I am Ananda and I'll be your host for today's Talk. With this, we begin the detox session under the theme Conflict of Time Memory. To engage with us today for an insightful dialogue and presentation, which help us know more about their personal journey and experience in the real of practice, we have with us today Gurmeet Sangha Rai. Uh, Gurmeet Rai, a conservation architect based in New Delhi. She established CRCI, Cultural Resource Conservation Initiative, a conservation consultancy firm which undertakes a wide range of projects within the domain of cultural heritage, conservation, and management practice in India. Gurmeet has been a specialist consultant to several UNESCO workshops in Asia Pacific and presently is involved in urban conservation with Hriday. And the other panelist that we have today is Arindam Dutta. Arindam Dutta, joining us from Massachusetts, is a professor of architecture history and at MIT. His teaching interests are in the area of modern architectural theory and history, imperialism, globalization, and third world politics, technology studies, and body politics, Marxist and post structuralist thought. He has authored and edited various books, Ancestralize, Nature, Architecture, and the Depth, Liberal Art Practice in the Liberalized Public Sphere, Sehmat being some of his ongoing works. Datta is also founding member of the Architectural Historians Collective called Aggregate. Thank you all for joining us today from different parts and various time zones. To quickly give a brief of the outline of the session. The first half of today's session will be two presentations by the panelists, followed by a conversation between them alongside the Q&A. Further, it will be open up to the attendees for questions and answer. I request the audience to ask questions in the Q&A tab of Zoom window and to mention the panelists the question is addressed to. When somebody's questions get selected, we will turn on your video and audio to make sure to, and also please make sure to upload the question that you wanted to be answered, and don't be shy in asking any sort of questions. So I request our first panelist, Gurmeet Sangha Rai, to share their presentation.
Good evening, everybody, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this forum. And of late, I'm more and more intrigued in engaging with the young minds and the bright young minds in India and abroad, because I find it extremely energizing to hear the young minds now than ever before, because I haven't been in the teaching field. I've been largely a practitioner, and I would say and I've always thought that I'm still learning. And so I never find myself equipped enough to teach anything. So I take the opportunity to share some of my works and to actually look forward to the questions as well. Is the presentation visible?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So I take this opportunity to share some of the projects that I've been engaged in, and I have looked at, through the entire career of mine, I've looked at the city of Amritsar as a working laboratory for myself. And every time I'm kind of thinking of a particular question, I find that city very interesting to go and test it out, to have conversations around it with fellow colleagues and cultural heritage practitioners. And what I would like to share with you is the way I read this, how I read the city, and especially, and it's in a way starts, the projects that I'm sharing with you is also in the sequence in which they unfolded in my life as well. So time and memory, or time-memory conflict. Yeah, so what becomes critical here is whose perception are we looking at here in this particular context of time and memory. Here, the journey that I'm sharing with you is that of an architect, but I see myself as a heritage practitioner, and I also see myself as a cultural heritage worker. There's a difference between the two, and I quite enjoy referring to myself as a cultural heritage worker. That way one negotiates many more spaces within the realm of cultural heritage. Like I said, that I'm going to be talking to you about Amritsar, and about the tangible and intangible, about the physical and the metaphysical, how it revealed to me, and how I choose to look at these aspects when I look at the physical aspects of the city today. It's about time, it's about space, it's about our people. The way the city, when you visit the city, you look at its natural features, the water, the land, and other cultural resources. The geopolitical conditions kind of stare you in your face through time, belief systems, political events, back about 400 years ago to very recent times, socioeconomic practices, institutions of governance, materials and skills, and all these that impacts the character of a place. The story of Amritsar begins with that of a water body called a sarovar. And interestingly, I mean, those of you who haven't been to Amritsar, you would find that the oldest part of the city is that of the walled city, and right in the heart of the walled city is this water body. And within the water body stands the Golden Temple, and that I'm sure, I would imagine, all are familiar with. That's what Amritsar is known for, is the site of the Golden Temple, and referred to as Sri Harimandir Sahib to the believers. This is a very important quotation. And I would say, as a cultural heritage worker, I realize that to be able to understand Amritsar, you also have to understand poetry. And poetry in the vernacular, poetry which is within the holy book of the Sikhs as a piece of literature. And there's a very, very important quotation there which says, Bani Guru, Guru hai Bani, which Bani Amritsare. Now this is very interesting, that the Guru, the teacher is the Bani, and and Bani is within the Guru, and within the Bani is Amritsar. So, or Amrit Sarovar is referred to as the Bani itself, or the word in the vernacular in the Guru Granth Sahib. So when you look at a piece of water, when you look at a water body, it's not just the physicality of it. There is a very, very important notion associated with the water body. This is what the Sarovar looks like, and this is an artist's impression, just to explain to you that over time, how the city grows and what the values of the city of the city are, which are all around this particular shrine, which is right the nucleus of the world city. So this is what is the Sarovar, and in the heart of it, you see the shrine here, and a causeway, just a single path that leads you to the shrine, and that itself has a very important, in symbolism, has a very important meaning about a single path that leads to the inner part of the shrine. The shrine did not look like this when it was built. It was built by the fifth Sikh Guru. Yeah, I forgot to mention that this particular Sarovar was excavated by the fourth Sikh Guru of the sixth Guru Ramdas. And it came to be, the place came to be known as Ramdaspur. And this Sarovar is also referred to as Ramdas Sarovar. So names become very important, from literature, poetry to names. The shrine was built by the fifth Sikh Guru, and what you see here is bricks being made, a kitchen of the Guru which is being run here for all the workers, the voluntary work that went into making of the shrine, and of course in the audience of the Guru. He is the one who actually composed or compiled the Guru Granth Sahib, which contains the poetry of the Sikh Gurus, the Sufi saints and Bhakti saints, and he edited the whole piece of writing to music. So the entire Guru Granth Sahib is sung out and to different rags. And so what you see here is also that particular practice as a work ethic around construction, around voluntary seva or the voluntary work, the collective, the kitchen of eating together, of the Bani that he refers to. So this particular painting actually explains a lot about the values associated with this particular site. And after that, when the construction was over, this is where the Guru Granth Sahib at that point was called the Adi Granth, was put within the shrine. Again, this is an artist's impression. This is not how the shrine looked like in the 15th, in the early part of the 17th century. 1604 is when the Guru Granth Sahib was put here. Over time, how the city grows with the subsequent Guru is this Guru Har Gobind is to the western part of the city and of the shrine, and the house of the Guru is within the locality, the residential areas around the shrine. He did not build his house within the precinct, but it was outside amidst the people of the area. The sixth Guru built a fort here to protect the site, and that is called the Lohgarh Fort, which today has a Gurdwara, a Sikh shrine. And this particular map is a map of 1870s, after Punjab became part of, first the East India came under the East India Company in 1849, and subsequently post 1857 under the British Crown. And this map was made in 1870s. So it actually shows you the alignment, where Harmandir Sahib is, where the Lohgarh Fort is, and subsequent a later fort that was built on the periphery of the walled city. And that particular fort on the periphery was made by this king, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who is very well known, at least to people in the northern India, more known to people of Punjab, and clearly merits being recognized in the national narrative. And for reasons which I don't think this is the, maybe I'll refer to it, mention that at a later point. So this is about Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and he's the one who's responsible for the gilding of the shrine. The site was desecrated several times in the 18th century. Ahmad Shah Abdali, coming down from Afghanistan, from the northwest frontier, desecrated the shrine several times. It was broken. It was, there are descriptions of being blown up with gunpowder, about carcasses of animals being thrown into the Sarovar. And every time they would leave, the Afghans used to leave, the Sikhs would rally together and reconstruct the shrine. So then this whole act of recovery and reconstruction and rebuilding the shrine is very much part of the narrative of the Sikh community and the association with Harmandir Sahib. The sacred site sat embedded seamlessly within the urban fabric till the early part of the 20th century. These are the old photographs. When you look at the skyline here, you see this entire dense fabric, because the boundaries of Harmandir Sahib were actually the Sarovar itself and the parikrama all around, the walk all around. It wasn't a building. And seamlessly the site merged with the habitation, with the people. It was for the people and by the people, and those were the fundamental tenets of the faith that was put down through practice. Now, this is a very important word, through practice. It wasn't something which was dictated. It wasn't something which was a law, and it was something which was translated into acts of engagement, and through various other aspects like seva, and how did that sense of ownership come about the site by the people of the community. Interestingly enough, if you were to look at the revenue records today, the ownership of Harmandir Sahib lies with the community, and the caretakers are the Shiromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee. So that's a very, very important aspect about how the historical, the history, memory, and current legal documents actually are consistent with that particular idea. The form of the site has evolved over time. The sacred complex did not come about by a single act of design or patronage. Now, as a cultural heritage practitioner, this is a very, very important, a very difficult problem and a very important question for us, that in the tenets of the faith, evolution and of the site has happened through the engagement of the community. It's the way the community responded to acts of history or events and how they came together and what were the principles that they upheld in this particular act of construction and reconstruction. This is just an image of the 19th century. In fact, probably, yeah, late 19th century, about the way the site looked. And it does not quite, I mean, the edge does not look like this anymore. Also, this is just for general information that while the city grew more towards the northwestern side, the eastern and the northeastern side had more earthen buildings. And these are the photographs of some of the earthen buildings. Because when I saw these black dots, I used to wonder what this was. And then you realize at the edge of the city, the walls were introduced by Maharaja Ranjit Singh in the early part of the 19th century. And so all these very, very village-like, architecture also became very much part of the city fabric. The British pulled down the walls and the gates, and they replaced it by newer forms of gates. And these are what those gates look like. These are the Colonial Gates, and I've been involved in the conservation of the city gates in a more recent project. But every bit, talking about significance, every bit of architecture actually has something to tell you. That towards the western side of the city, you have gates which look like this, but towards the eastern part of the city, the gates look like this. So this itself denotes that how significant was that part of the city to the city managers or the government of that time, and how the western side was given much more importance than the eastern side, and that is reflected in the city gates itself. The sacred precinct is, about reading architecture, is unique in its planning, manifestation of the Sikh philosophy. The key elements in this particular, in the whole complex, you have the shrine, you have the Akal Takht, which was, which translates into the throne of the eternal. The Langar, which is a free kitchen and a free accommodation, Guru Ramdas Sarai, sit along the central axis. And the key elements are the Dharamsal. Dharamsal is like a Dharamshala for free accommodation and to give shelter to the weak. And this is a very, very important tenets of the Sikh faith, of contemplation, of collective, of rightful living, and sharing your earnings with the community through seva, which is voluntary work, whether you whether you give a donation, or which is in kind, or do your engagement with the community by way of giving your time in it. And that is the act of seva. So it could be with tan, man, or dhan. So tan is with the bodily engagement, man will be with the spiritual engagement, and your dhan would be through your earnings. So this whole engagement, you are even given an option in terms of how do you engage with the collective good. And this relationship I've already explained to you. Over time, there is this 500 years of history of love, devotion, strife, and care. And that is what I was explaining. And that is explaining to you earlier, which is about the folklore, which is around which folklore gets created. the sacrifice of the community in protecting the faith through your tan. This is through your body. And this is the ultimate offering, which is through sacrificing of the self in the physical terms. Now, talking about time, memory, and conflict, now this is something which is not understood. If you were to the Western world, offering your life to a cause is not something understood as an act of peace. It's understood as an act of violence. So this is something which needs to be understood better by us, that what does this mean to a particular community, and in what context does this come up through history and cultural interpretations. There are several in the architecture of Harmandir Sahib, there are some very important fundamental principles. For instance, laying of the foundation stone of the site was by Hazrat Mian Mir, the fifth Sikh Guru, invited the Sufi saint from Lahore to lay the foundation of this particular site, which represents cultural plurality and new ground for social life. The site is at a low-lying area on principles of humility and access to all. Free passage. There are no doors to the gateways. Earlier, the city sat, the site sat seamlessly within the city fabric, so you could enter the site from multiple directions. And subsequently, over time, in the recent past, in 1920s, when the site came under the management of a newly constructed organization called SGPC, which is a mini parliament of the Sikhs, they kind of redefine the edge, but there are no shutters to those doors. So the site is open throughout the day, throughout the year. The faithscape, which I've already explained, interestingly enough, that all the architectural principles that have been followed in making of Sri Harmandir Sahib are actually are using principles of the vernacular. They are actually, they deviate from the principles of classical architecture, and from the water tank, which is also not a square, to even the angles, to the direction, to the dimensions, there is a difference. Each side is different. If you were to look at the form itself, you've got in plan, you have the perfect cube. In the center, you have a double height space, which is referred to as the Prakash Sthan, which is the illuminated space, but the self-illuminated space. And within that lies the Guru Granth Sahib, through which the light comes into the world. So the light comes out of the site. It does not come from outside, from within the site, and not from outside the site. And above you have a cube here holding the perfect, the Akal Purkh, the word in the vernacular inside the Prakash Sthan. But the cube is broken with this additional bay, which breaks the perfect cube. In terms of in terms of the principles of architecture, like I said, it's got multiple other elements from different faiths as well. Over time, this site was reconstructed, which I mentioned earlier, and it was during the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh when it got embellished with these beautiful surfaces. And you've got the inlay work on the exterior with motifs of life in the waters, which is on the floor. You've got these beautiful turtles and fishes, amazing configurations of inlay work. And then you have on the walls, the life on Earth, planet Earth, in terms of above and inside. Right inside, I was one day waiting to see what kind of a floor would emerge from the place where Guru Granth Sahib is placed. And when they rolled the carpet, what I saw was a plain piece of stone. And this is where I would compare it with the Hindu temples as well, that once you're inside, what matters is what is contained in the holy book. It's not about the renderings and the embellishments, which is the Maya, the elements from the material world. And this is where it is, which I've already explained, is about the word in vernacular, is the Guru Granth Sahib, and it is the it is referred to, or it's understood or recognized as the body of the Guru itself. So the rituals in Harmandir Sahib is treating the Guru Granth Sahib as the body of the Guru itself. So even in terms of the reading out of the Guru Granth Sahib is actually follows the same pattern as it would in the times when the gurus were physically present, when they were there in the early part of the 17th century. Because when the guru would have come from his house, entered the site, when he would have gone into the shrine, the readings that would have happened at that point, to when he would go to the Akal Takht and listen to the problems of people, to be able to address that. So the rituals in Harmandir Sahib is exactly the same way that it would have been during the times of during the life of the Guru in his physical form. So talking about time and memory, the ritual captures the timelessness of the presence of the Guru in this particular space. The other thing which is very, very significant, or the most significant aspect of the site, is the Bani and the soundscape. So from within, I mean, of course, today you have, you can just hear the Bani outside as well. But in the absence of the microphones and, the speakers and so on in the past years, in the past, several decades ago, the recitation from within the Bani, from within the Guru Granth Sahib, would happen from the inner shrine and would also happen in multiple other places as well. The Akal Takht would hold the Guru Granth Sahib as well, and sing, and similarly here. So the engagement with the Bani, the access to the Bani was available to everybody, irrespective of caste or creed or gender. And the fact that you had to be lettered to be able to read the Guru Granth Sahib, but to be able to hear it, you didn't have to be lettered, because the Guru Granth Sahib is written in the spoken word, in the vernacular. So the way you speak, that's the way the language had developed, and that is what has been used to write the Bani of the Gurus and the Bhakti saints and the Sufi saints. So that's how it makes that information, that poetry is available to everybody. Selfless service is something which I've already shared with you. And the tenant, the Guru said, Pehle Pangat, Phir Sangat. That first, go and engage with the collective kitchen, go and eat there, be with your fellow beings. And after you've done that, then you come to the Guru. So this is one way that the social caste norms and the gender divisions and all were addressed. In fact, there are stories about the Guru saying that, okay, the head is covered out of reverence, but no covering of your face and so on. So in practice, a lot of the principles were put, which kind of demonstrates, the norms, the aspects that we talk today about in sustainable development goals. You're talking about equity, you're talking about gender equality, social justice, all those principles. You actually see that this particular faith actually institutionalized through their different practices on the site of Harmandir Sahib. And then, of course, there's this Ishnan in the Amrit Sarovar. So when I look at this particular site, what does it mean to me? If you were to look at it about time and memory and association and perception of the community, for me, it's the idea. It's got all the principles of a good public space design. There is a space for information, there's a space for participation and engagement, and there's a space for contemplation. And the fact that it is built in a particular way that allows access, enables access for everybody. The fact that all knowledge that it embodies is accessible to everybody. So the use of multiple senses, whether it is, all the five senses, are there you can experience the site through all your senses. It's not about a piece of architecture that you only see, or a piece of music that you're only hearing, or when you're eating, there's a taste, there's a smell, there is a experience of that particular space with all these multiple aspects that come together. This these are the values that when you go to the city of Amritsar, this is what the centerpiece of the entire city is Harmandir Sahib, and those are the values that it upholds. What happens later? Once a site is created, a certain practice is brought in, and through practice and certain memory, it's institutionalized. This goes on and on through the 19th century, through those, why do the Sikhs rally around, and not just the Sikhs, I would imagine, I would say the people of this area would rally around the sacred site for its reconstruction. And then you have the early part of the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, where multiple, in fact, the other day I was listening to somebody who spoke about that there's not just one narrative on the freedom movement of this country. There are multiple narratives. A lot of people, a lot of groups, a lot of movements were taking place across the subcontinent, which contributed to the independence of this India, of the country. It wasn't just one movement, centralized action by one group of people or one political ideology. And here what you see is the non-violent, this is from a newspaper, from a British newspaper, where it says, assembled before the altar of the immortality in the Golden Temple at Amritsar, Akalis, in brackets, it says Sikh fanatics, reciting their morning scripture before taking an oath of non-violence or passive resistance to the government. And there are amazing records of the early part of the 20th century, before Jallianwala Bagh, when the Sikhs actually, again, I'm saying Sikhs here because the Akalis are here, when the Punjabis were actually engaging in the freedom movement. And where in the landscape of Amritsar, the Amrit Sarovar becomes very important, because they come, they take a dip in that. And what does Amrit mean? Amrit means Amrityu, the one that does not die. And they take a dip in the waters of Sarovar. They take the permission or Agya from the Guru at the Akal Takht. And Akal Takht symbolizes your physical existence in the world, whereas Harmandir Sahib is about the philosophical or the guidance space. So it's a Miri and the Piri, the temporal and the spiritual. So they take permission here before they go for their thing. So the phenomena in terms of a memory of a people is concerned, the phenomena of the Sarovar and the Bani is what, around which the physical space of Harmandir Sahib is kind of located. So Amritsar, so Harmandir Sahib was considered for World Heritage nomination, and I was involved in leading the group to prepare the nomination dossier. And it got, in the last moment, it was withdrawn by the site managers. And there were a lot of complexities, and those complexities are around perception. And perception of what happens the moment you come under a label of World Heritage. Does that mean somebody else decides how the site is going to be governed? What happens? Does it disempower the community? And what is this community? Is this community the one that lives around the site, or is this a community, a larger global community? How do you define authenticity and integrity in a site like this, where renewal happens of materiality? We as architects, as cultural heritage practitioners, engage with this all the time. Then what are the principles for the conservation plan? Here, what I've explained to you is the whole narrative of time and memory and perception and faith. And then as cultural heritage practitioners, when you come in, what are the principles that you uphold, and what are the principles that should inform the conservation plan or help define authenticity and integrity of this site? And then therefore, because authenticity and integrity and the conservation plan is very, very important for a World Heritage listing, and how does the community perceive that? And the second monument that I'd speak to you about is that of the Rambar Garden, which is in Amritsar. And here, this is in this map, you see the walled city of Amritsar, Harmandir Sahib in the center. This is the Rambar Garden, and this is the Gopinger Fort. This is a monument of national significance. It is a site that got inscription in 2004. What you see here is a cultural mapping that we did of the site as part of another project. And why I show this is because we realize that the history and the cultural narrative of Amritsar can be, if we were to go by words, our way of, as practitioners, was that we can actually see 5 R's in the themes of the history and cultural narrative of the site, of the city of Amritsar, with all its sites: reverence, resonance, remembrance, revelations, and reconciliation. These are the 5 words which we feel capture this whole cultural narrative of time, memory, and of tangible and intangible heritage of the city of Amritsar. So the Ramba Garden itself captures, there are all 5 which can be read in this, because this was the summer palace of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who made this quadripartite garden with this, layout, and how it transformed when the British took over. They actually obliterated, they removed the fortification wall, they put in these roads, they put the deputy commissioner's office, a library, a police office, and multiple clubs, the Amritsar Club, the Service Club, the Lumsden Club. And they were making these institutions at the same time as when the Punjabis were fighting for independence towards the early part of the 20th century. So you see new institutions being created like clubs by the government of the day, while they obliterated the physical form of a particular site. And when you look at the intangible heritage of the city, there is another movement that is happening, which is the independence movement. And again, how do you look at time and memory here? And how do you look at how do you read the physical fabric? This is another photograph of the great procession of the natives on their way to the temple of Amritsar to pledge resistance to the British rule. And at the same time, when they are building these clubs there. So today, when you see the site, you see these 3 clubs, which occupy a large part of the garden. And today, the Archaeological Survey of India has protected this whole garden in 2004. And there is a case in the Chandigarh, in the Punjab and Haryana High Court, where the people at the clubs actually sent a request to the Archaeological Survey of India that we'd like this site to be denotified because our clubs are also part of the heritage of this site. Now, this is a question. How do you engage with the site? What do you do? What is the solution for this particular site? This is the notification of ASI. And as you see, just some glimpses of this particular building. A big comment on the architecture. I will not go into this because I think there's going to be time issues. What this building looks like, it's got similar architectural principles as like the Golden Temple. I was explaining the form to you. When you study the form of this, you'll see some similarities in the building, in the spatial design, some remnants of embellishments in the building. This is Khatambandi roof, the false ceilings that a tradition of Kashmir, which was used in this particular building. The relatively easier part of recovery to recover the footprint of the historic buildings is structures like this, which had got converted into an office of the civil defense. And it took us a bit of an effort from our part and a lot of effort by the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar to relocate that office to be able to recover the form. So this is what it had become. And then finally we recovered the form of the building. The garden, restoring the spirit of the place. We did do a bit of archaeology to try to figure out what the garden landscape would have looked like. And we've constructed the pathways and so on, but not because we found evidence, but more because we are recovering the spirit of the place. So, and what is the spirit of the place? These are some of the drawings. We did some excavations on the water channels built by the Municipal Corporation of Amritsar and found this is just about 2.5 meters. And then we found this 5-meter lime concrete base of an earlier water channel, the same place, what we were able to recover. So the possibilities are immense. The heritage practitioners would say, okay, we need to restore the Anglo-Sikh footprint of this particular site. But the people who are the members of the clubs would not hear of it. They would rather have the clubs going on. And of course, they are the ones who have a stronger hand. Why? Because they are the influential people and they are the ones who matter to the politician. So it's been several years of hard work. And yesterday what was being discussed is also about that. How do you negotiate change? And this is where we are with Amritsar. And while we've recovered part of the garden and the conservation of the buildings, we've also been able to put into the ground the edge definition of the Charbagh, whatever was possible, kind of chipping at the block of trying to recover the public space. The principle here is not just that we're not just recovering the memory of Maharaja Ranjit Singh's time, which is the Charbagh. We're also saying that this is an 80-acre garden, which is the largest and probably, Amritsar has great challenges in terms of the open spaces. There are very, very few open spaces in the city. And by removing these clubs, you're actually giving a far larger footprint of an open space to the people of Amritsar. But right now, these clubs won't hear of that. This is another fort. This is the other building I was telling you about, which is the Gopinger Fort. And this itself has taken a bit of a challenge to be able to recover the fort. People had completely forgotten that the fort even existed in Amritsar. This was within the military cantonment. It took a lot of effort for the fort to be recovered from the army, and the Prime Minister at that point, the Government of India, then transferred the property to the Government of Punjab, but unfortunately to the Department of Tourism, which itself has a price to pay because tourism has a different perception. And when tourism comes into play, I don't think there's very much space for many people to speak about the community's narrative and their perception of their heritage. It becomes something to be commodified, something to be attractive for an imaginary tourist who's going to come to the site, and you need to entertain the tourists. So a lot is lost, a very, very thick layer of a particular narrative gets imposed on a cultural heritage site when you start imagining who the user is, and especially if it is going to be the fly-by-night tourist who you're imagining what he or she would like to see on the site. So some beautification starts happening. Some lions, fiberglass lions are put on top. Some decorative grills come up. Some fake flags are put on top. This is just about, there is a way to conserve, there's a way to read a building, there's a way for layered history to be understood. And of course, there is space for innovation. But whether it needs to be so kitsch is what is questionable. You see all this nonsense that goes on. I mean, you find a building like this, you try to recover, you read the building, you see you see the Anglo layer and you see the Sikh layer. But when the tourist layer comes up, then you kind of wonder whether it's been worth this. Of course, the form is authentic, but all the paint work that has happened on it is imagining the tourist. Some more glimpses of the conservation work and what has happened in the fort. And then within that, when I talk about layered history and the physical relics or remains that tell you more, so reading a building becomes very exciting because the form, the archaeology more specifically, and remnants of this material give you the aha factor. I mean, not just as a practitioner, I've tested this with the young people, with children, and I think it becomes like a puzzle, and that puzzle appeals to a lot of people. How do you correlate archival texts with material evidence and your folklore, and how do you read a building? And then how do you experience time through a particular heritage site at a particular moment, and whether and how memories, and it's almost like when all these multiple layers of information are put one on top of the other, people start narrating to the story to you as if they were present in 1847 or 1849, how the battle has happened. It's amazing how multi-layered information becomes a trigger for people to actually take that narrative as a more personal narrative. Quickly through the Rambar Gate, which we restored in a recent time. Like I said, the first one, the Ramba Garden is ASI. Harmandir Sahib is an unprotected building by law, but protected by the community through centuries. The Ramba Garden is an ASI protected monument, the highest level of protection in the country of a historical building is ASI. The Gopinger Fort is a state protected monument. And Rambar Gate is again an unprotected monument. The only surviving gate from the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. This is what it was like when we saw it. And it was, the memory of the people around it was that it was an interrogation center during the militancy period of Punjab. And so they said that we would not even look at the site because there was, there are also descriptions of sounds that they occasionally would get to hear from within the complex, within the building. So you can imagine the kind of violent memory people have about this site. The people who live around the site have no association with Amritsar as such because the market all around is of the refugees who came from Pakistan, and about 45% of the population of Amritsar actually changed with that one act of partition, and that is recent memory of a people. So through multiple projects, partly through a tourism project where we were able to recover part of the building, and what this building houses is like you have the gate here, and then you have part of the ramparts of the walled city, and on top some recycled material, the small brick called the Nanakshahi brick in Punjab was utilized to build this L-shaped building. And the way we found it was that there was a children's school here in a very bad way, and there was a printing press, 100-year-old printing press here, and there was the police station here. That's how we originally found. This is what the rampart looked like. This is what the school looked like. Children, there were 2 classrooms running out of 1 room, and the children come from very, very economically weaker, section of society, and it's a government school. This is the printing press, how it looked like when we found it. And this is part of a fortification wall of the colonial period, very close to the gates. Over time, we were able to restore the gate. And what we upheld very, very close to our heart was that the school must be restored. Each classroom must get a single classroom, a room to run out of. So this classroom was kind of restored. We restored the printing press, did some bit of dramatic intervention. It doesn't look like the scarlet red here, but we picked up the color palette from buildings of Lahore and Amritsar to be able to draw the attention of the community all around this particular gate. We actually reached out to do their facade painting as well with a similar color palette to start the conversations going. How do you get them to participate and draw their attention? Because years of conservation was not enough. And then we around that we should position a community museum here, which we call Lok Virsa, which is culture. Been there now for a year and a half. This has been the chandelier-like thing has been created with the local crafts. This is a little event that we have had on as a part of the inaugural thing, made a little film on the story of Amritsar, which we kind of have housed it within one of the buildings and had this very, very interesting performing arts thing where it's called a Jago. Jago is a performance which they do when there's a wedding in your family in Punjab, in a village. Then at night, these women go out singing that song. They pass through the village, inviting the village people to the wedding the next day. So we had this little performance done, and they walked through the streets of Amritsar to inviting people to the Rambar Gate, saying that their museum was ready. the next day we had this particular function where a little story of Amritsar was enacted. And for the first time, these children reached out to me and said that we also want to dance. And I said, why do you want to dance? And they said, because we also have a new school. And then we had the people, the drummer play the dholki at the drums, and the children had no, they were just not conscious, and they were not self-conscious that they were officers in the audience and all that. They just got onto the stage and they went down to perform for themselves and as a collective. So this kind of completely put a point across to me that memory has to be generated, that memory is critical to be able to have a sense of association with place, and history and culture is a continuous phenomena. If we do not continue to engage with our cultural sites, with our cultural narratives, it's going to be in a vacuum. And you leave the stage vacant for somebody else to hijack that space. So if you need that space to be the community space, activities and memories have to be enabled in cultural heritage sites. So thank you very much. And I know I've overshot my time, but the story had to be complete. So thank you. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We would like, thank you for your amazing presentation. We would like to start the second presentation by Arindam sir. And yeah.
Oh, I just realized I'd muted myself. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to this very important forum dedicated to my teacher. So it's a very special moment for me to be here. I'm going to talk about what I do, or rather sort of try and convey to you the kind of sensibility that I work with. I am a researcher, a scholar, and a teacher. And so this sensibility sort of pervades my practice, both as a researcher in the way that I think and issues that I particularly find most interesting to take up, but also in the way that I teach and the sensibilities that I try to convey to my students when bringing across different kinds of cases and studies. So quick introduction, hold on. Quick introduction to some of my work. My first book was on, I consider myself a scholar of institutions. What I'm most interested in learning about and thinking about is how institutions actually become critical in the way that modern life or life in any other period is constructed. And by institutions, I mean collective action premised in some kind of normative behavior that belongs to the institution and mandates its members to work in that capacity. Yeah. So my first book was on this bureaucracy, which was based out of London, but became very important across the colonial world. In fact, all the art schools in India were formed as sort of branches of that large decentralized bureaucracy based in South Kensington, which is now the Victoria and Albert Museum. And a central feature that I was very interested in is the way that craft and the discourse of craft and the pedagogy of craft became institutionalized in the 19th century and then became part of official discourse, let's say in Indian nationalist discourse or American school training and so on and so forth. Why I was interested in craft is that one always thinks of craft as something that goes back to the past, something that is before the present, that industry is constantly annihilating, and somehow we have to restore craft, we have to bring back craft, etc., and so on and so forth. If I were to tell you that a term such as craft was not critically engaged until the 1850s, if you look at any book previous to the 1850s, none of them will mention the word craft. So it's only after a certain industrial revolution has taken place in Europe that something called craft is theorized as the opposite of what is happening in the commercial sphere. So somehow that which needs to be recovered, somehow we are missing out on something, so we are nostalgic about something, that it comes to be named craft, and how to recover it and how to think about it becomes part of the very central apparatus of modern thinking. So in my view, craft is not something that disappears. It's actually part and parcel of the contemporary cultural politics of our times. Having done that work, I belong to a group of historians. We sort of formed ourselves in 2007. And this group of historians was very much invested, again, in sort of the politics of institutions. And what we were eager to get beyond was this view of the architect as the progenitor of the architectural situation or the building. Our argument was that buildings are in fact made by multiple factors, economics, politics, institutional dynamics, laws, etc. So our challenge was, how do you write a history of architecture or of urban spaces or of urban politics without always necessarily centralizing the architect as the principal story? So some of that discussion I was bringing forward in yesterday's comments. So how do we write a history of architecture without the architects being in the center? So devising techniques of sort of modeling multiple forms of agency in the production of architecture. Another, and of course I would be remiss if I did not bring some of that critical thought and that methodological approach to my own situation. And so you published this, we did this project, which is sort of a doorstopper of a book, 1,000-page book on my own institution. And I don't know what your views are on MIT, but if things in the popular press are things to go by, it's this center of technology, it's sort of, et cetera, and so on and so forth. I can tell you that the view of MIT presented from within its institutional marrow, as it were, is a very different one here as portrayed in this book. It looks into the inner workings of an institution and its own dynamics, as it sort of related to architecture, particularly in the period between 1950 and 1980. Currently, talking about time and memory, I left India in 1993, which was the year after the demolition of the Babri Masjid. And it's sort of that history in many ways is the history of my generation, of what happened before and what has happened since. And this is a project that it's sort of a 20-year engagement, and I'm finally getting around to finishing it in this year. And it's on this group called Sehmat, which some of you may be familiar with or not, the Sardar Hashmi Memorial Trust, whom I came to know as a student in Ahmedabad, but have been very closely involved with since then. And I'll leave that aside for now in terms of what that's about, but just to give you a sense of some of the issues that So this is something that is forthcoming in the next couple of years. Sorry. Okay. So what I want to talk about, and I'll try and keep it very tight, is some of the work that I've been doing through my lab. Now, you might think of a lab, I mean, talking about the politics of institutions, you might think of a lab as some kind of actual physical space with people working on desks and having a separate room and perhaps even wearing smocks and going around different pieces of technology. A lab at MIT is really a budget heading. We don't have a space. We hire students as and when projects come up. And that in itself is a sort of fascinating story of, the global disease, institutional disease of labs that are now being created in every university. My friend Shailesh Trivedi, who's ex-head of CEPT R&D, we is now in the US, but we joke a lot about this whole effort of research within institutions. So take this with a pinch of salt and a good dose of humor when I say lab and the kind of work that we do here. So let me to bring matters to some focus in terms of both the kind of work that I'm currently doing, one of the projects that I'm currently doing, but to also highlight this sensibility that I'm talking about, this politics of institutions and the politics of infrastructure. I take you to this slide. Some of you might recognize it from the river, which is the Ganga. And the city we are talking about is, and we're looking at, is Patna, okay? So if you look at this bridge, this is the Gandhi Setu, built by Gammon India in the 1980s. And if I'm not correct, if I'm not wrong, it's the first bridge across the Ganga in Bihar built in independent India. And on the left is another bridge that is being constructed. Both of them go to Hajipur in the north. And it's sort of interesting to look at both bridges somewhat in isolation. So this is the Gandhi Setu. By the way, sort of the link with Gurmeet's presentation here is that Guru Gobind Singh's birthplace is very close to this site, and it's an important Sikh pilgrimage site as well. So anyway, the bridge is built by Gammon India. This is the Gandhi Setu, and some years ago, this is what happened. This causes huge traffic bottlenecks on either side, requiring vehicles to wait for 6, 7, sometimes 12 hours for trucks to cross. But what you can also see is, like, these are not like the bridges in Ahmedabad, half a kilometer long. It tells you something about the Ganga. You practically can't see the end of the bridge, which means that these are tremendous capital investments that have to be made if you were to traverse the Ganga. This is the other bridge. And if you look at the north side of the bridge, you're going to go here and then the bridge sort of peters off. There's no ramp going down, okay? And the same is the case on the south. There's no ramp going down either. Now, why does this happen? And this is a critical part of what I'm trying to convey. This is a critical component of what I'm trying to convey here through my presentation. What we're looking at is a division of jurisdictions. The river belongs to somebody else. The bank of the river actually belongs to somebody else. But both of those belong to the central government. The land beyond these two properties belong to local owners, but also where the local state politics has more of a say rather than the central bridge where central politics has a bigger role. So throughout this talk, by the way, I will be mentioning several political parties and their leaders, but I will not be actually naming them. I'll leave you to guess who they are, and not so try and sort of make it obvious. So in this case, what happened on both sides is one political party, and this is a lot of what I'm saying is somewhat hearsay, so take it again with a pinch of salt. One political party organized its local cadres to buy up the land on either side of the bridge. This local party is currently in opposition, its leader is in prison. And they bought up the land on either side of the bridge, and they're holding up the dropping of the ramp to gain further benefits of whatever kind. Now, this is if you think about it, this is the classic definition of rent seeking, or today we might like to also call it corruption. The idea that somehow somebody gets in the way of building infrastructure seems in itself such a corrupt act that we can only blame the person who gets in the way of building a road. But one needs to think about this a little bit more carefully. So on some level, I would say that my thought processes go beyond, somewhat agnostic to conventional morality, and it's important to think beyond those terms when it comes to large infrastructural projects, to think carefully about what kinds of interests are at stake. Okay, so we did some studies around this region, and what we found was very interesting. If you look at sort of car ownership or vehicle ownership in Bihar, which is one of the most densest population, one of the most densely populated states in India, it's actually the lowest. So there are very few people with cars in this whole state. There are very few people with motorized vehicles, period. I mean, these are more studies that sort of demonstrate the same thing. And what we realized, we went to the northern districts and we did traffic studies, and it turns out that also the northern districts, the districts north of the Ganga, have very few roads, but on the other hand, they have very little traffic as well. In other words, there are very few roads, but there is practically nowhere for people to actually go to. Or to put it differently, the level of economic activity to the north of the Ganga is so low that the reason to build, the reason to go anywhere and to use transportation is equally low. So then this begs the question of who is the bridge for? I just want to, while I leave you with that thought, I want to just play this little video just to give you a sense of the income level of people in Bihar. Many of you may already be familiar with this, but nonetheless, it's worth, this is a video I took on the Ganga. So what these people are doing is something vaguely illegal. They're taking up silt from the bottom of the river to carry off to construction sites in the vicinity. You can only imagine how much income they might make doing this. They do this all day. The boat goes downstream and then they power it upstream again, and they keep doing this. They keep cycling up and down the river to maybe collect a truck full of soil at each point after each journey. So most people in this area make 150, 100, 200 rupees a day maximum if they're well-to-do. So the begged question is, this brings back the question of capital costs, right? I mean, if you were to build a bridge to the north of the Ganga, what kind of economic activity would actually pay for that kind of bridge? Would that bridge ever justify itself in economic terms? The answer quite simply is no. But that is not a reason to build a bridge. And this is why the politics of infrastructure is truly a politics. Bridges, I mean, transportation is a necessity sometimes to spur economic activity. So you could say that the more mobility and the more connectivity that the northern part has with the south, that would be a good reason to build bridges. I should point out that this entire area of the Ganga, from roughly Haldia to Varanasi and Allahabad, there's no more than, I think, 20 bridges. That's almost 1,200 miles or 2,000 kilometers of territory in a very wide river that's almost impossible to cross. I mean, if you think of Ahmedabad, it has 6 bridges, right? And there are 20 in this entire territory. So one thing we found is that this northern part of India, this part, is actually practically cut off from the mainland. You could say that this is an island in the shadow of the Himalayas. But the politics of bridges plays itself out in other ways as well. Because there is no economy here, governments tend to be quite skittish about building bridges here, because the money will never ever be justified. So that has been the fiscal challenges have been one of the major reasons why so few bridges have been built. And then when the bridges get built, this kind of politics happens. But it's the other question that that's sort of worth asking is, and this is the challenge that was posed by the local state party before. If the bridge is being built by a central authority, right, then the central authority are the people who give out the contract, and very likely that contract is to go from will go to somebody who is outside the state. So it'll become a very central project. So the question of the actual economic benefits of the bridge being built there may or may not be conveyed to the local economy. In other words, nobody within the local economy will actually benefit from the actual money that goes into the building of the bridge. So this is one thing sort of worth thinking about, is how do local populations benefit from infrastructure? And I point out this story of quote unquote corruption to just sort of highlight the tensions of economy and politics that sort of manifest themselves in that, okay? So on that note, my lab, we are an academic institution and we've partnered with a planning firm here in Boston called Thompson Design Group. And we support the sort of research end of, suggesting something else, which is to say that, well, if bridges are so expensive and bring up all these other kinds of politics, why not think of more localized infrastructure such as ferries, etc., that actually make the river much more traversable, and therefore integrating the north and south bank. Again, in my view, it's a very good idea, which makes me suspect that it will never come into reality because it's such a good idea. But anyway, we are supplying. We've been doing a lot of studies up and down the Ganga to think about how infrastructure can be more localized and more, even if it's handed out by the central government, to make it more locally sensitive, locally in terms of economic benefits going to sort of the regions or the neighborhoods or the towns that these infrastructural inserts abut. I should mention that we are only doing a feasibility study. It's not a full-on design project. We are an academic institution. We cannot take on the risk of actually realizing a bridge, sorry, a ferry station or a ferry terminal. But we've done sort of very close mappings of local economies, neighborhoods, etc., to look at how benefits can be geared between cities, neighborhoods, and these sort of distributed infrastructures. And potentially these, you can do these very cheaply up and down the Ganga, allowing traversal of the Ganga both for people and transport. I should mention that the project itself is, the feasibility study is being funded by a central government authority which has the mandate to make the Ganga navigable. And one of the economic drivers for making the Ganga navigable is, oddly enough, the transportation of coal to supply the northern Indian energy market. A certain person close to the Prime Minister who formerly was, who made his money initially in grocery stores and now has acquired several coal mining licenses both in India and in Australia and Indonesia, is trying to move high-grade coal from the rest of the world into northern India. And so that's what's paying for, at least that's one of the major drivers. I'm not sure that's exactly paying for it, but it's one of the major drivers or interests behind pushing navigability of the Ganga, because otherwise coal has to be transshipped from ships to trains and then trucks, which itself are cost intensive. Sorry, is somebody trying to say something? Okay. So in a way, architecture here, it's very much like the Sabarmati project. Architecture here becomes an externality of a mega project, which is the, pushing the navigability of the Ganga. But we were able to convey to the administration the benefits that can come to abutting populations from a major infrastructure project, and hence this feasibility study. This brings me to a kind of related problem. So if you look at, this is a population map of India, population density. If you look at this area, which is roughly the area, again, north of the Ganges, which I said was practically cut off from the rest of India, this is where the heaviest population density occurs in India, right? This alone is like 350 million people, which is equal to the population of the United States. But if you compare urbanization, if you compare population density to urbanization, and more particularly the rate of urbanization in the last 30 years, then what you see is that it is the rest of India that is urbanizing much faster. And this is a project that I'm working on with Sai Balakrishnan, who was a professor at Harvard, but now has taken up a position at Berkeley. Why should this be the case? And this is a puzzle that I think we have solved, but on many levels, and it's a complicated answer, but I think you can see why this must be the case based on the story of the bridge I gave you, is that population density by itself does not amount to a market. And urbanization, broadly speaking, is a story of is an economic story. And so oddly enough, it is in the more arid regions, the less populated regions of this country that we see more urbanization coming up. And a lot of it actually goes back to the Green Revolution. I'll put the story, that explanation aside for Q&A if people want to know more. It's a slightly complicated and layered, but this is a big paradox. So yesterday we had somebody present a project on the Shahpur Metro in Ahmedabad, and the argument that was voiced was, well, the population is increasing and therefore we should have infrastructure. But oddly enough, if you look at where infrastructure projects go in India, it's to populations that have relatively lower density. So infrastructure is in fact not a natural outcome of urbanization. It is actually sometimes its cause, and why infrastructure happens in a particular place and in a particular location has to do often with political power dispensations, group politics, particularly the role of middle farmer constituencies in India, Jats, Patels, Marathas, Reddys, etc., who have become major entrepreneurs in real estate over the last 30 years. So I'm just giving you hints of that story, but I want you to think about this paradox that infrastructure is never a response to real need. It is a response to economic demand, which means that, I mean, on some level, this means that it is people who already have the money to pay for infrastructure, who get infrastructure, that creates a sort of virtuous cycle that places with more infrastructure keep getting more and more infrastructure down the line, as opposed to places with very little infrastructure. The infrastructure level just keeps, the disparity between those regions and the places with infrastructure just keeps increasing over time. So it's no coincidence that this area, which is the most heavily populated, is in fact supplying much of the labor that goes to make up the cities in the rest of India. And we know that from the current, the migrancy crisis and the walking across India that happened only a couple of months ago, okay? 3 more examples. This is Calcutta. And so this pattern of deurbanization, let us say, that's sort of very true of the Gangetic region, is nowhere more true than the city of Calcutta, which, if you think about it, in 1950, this was India's richest city. It was the most metropolitan city. It had the largest amount of infrastructure, but since has seen almost continuous decline. And in fact, to the extent that most of its elites or anybody who has any wealth and can afford to get out of the city, there's a pattern of people actually leaving the city. So there's a kind of depopulation of the more moneyed elite from the city. And why should this be the case? I mean, there are many historical factors, some of them true, some of them are not. One is used to the jokes about Bengalis. I put that aside, being a Bengali myself, much of which, by the way, rings true. There's jokes about communists, but there are also other historical factors such as partition. I mean, Calcutta actually absorbed millions of people during partition and then during the Bangladesh war. I mean, the city was besieged and beleaguered by about 10 million people after 1950. But that should, in fact, again, if the population density is why urbanization happens, then this city should be growing. Why it isn't is linked with some of the stories that I have already told you. So again, infrastructure politics, there are 3 bridges. Again, I like to talk about bridges because they typically traverse multiple jurisdictional territory. So this is what is known as the New Hara Bridge, built from the 1980s onwards. Took about 25 years to build. This is, of course, the iconic Hara Bridge, sorry. And this is the another bridge, actually 2 bridges near Dakshineshwar, which is to the north of Calcutta. And each of them, I think, if you think about it, sort of tell you very interesting stories about jurisdictions, budgets, governments, and clientele. So this is Hara Bridge, it's a bridge that you're probably very familiar with. This is Hara Station, which is possibly, I mean, it competes with, I think, VT. The most number of trains coming into the station on any given day, about 900 trains. Hara Bridge is the most heavily trafficked cantilever bridge in the world. 120,000 vehicles cross it every day. And roughly 1 million people cross it on foot on any given day, right? So you would think that this is a major infrastructure node. The reason why, the reason why this peculiar arrangement happens is that Calcutta is actually on the wrong side of India. And this goes back to my Bihar story. Since the hinterland of Calcutta was in fact to the east in Bangladesh, this is a well-known story. When they built the railways came and stopped on the other side. And that sort of created this problem of how do you link the rest of India to Calcutta. And it took no less than about 70 years to figure out a governance strategy and a business strategy that would make that work. I should point out that the Hara Bridge was built by the same international company that built the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Bosphorus Bridge, although the steel was supplied by Tata Steel, and was a major factor in building up Tata Steel's reputation at its Jamshedpur plant. But the first the Bengal Act, the Hara Bridge Act, was written in 1871, and the bridge was really started only in the 1930s. So think about 70 years of figuring out how to pay for a bridge and what kind of governance strategy you should have. And so the bridge is in fact its own corporation. It's a little sovereign entity in its own right. But this sort of brings up this very peculiar story here. So, and this is again a sort of jurisdictional question. So this is the railways, right? This part belongs to Hara municipality. This is a separate company. This is a home guard land and military land. So those guys do not cede. I was talking about this yesterday. Neither of these people cede their land to public use. So the bridge is sort of stuck by itself. It stands like a little idol, like a little sculpture by itself. And then on either side, you have this mess of a leak that somewhat filters or feeds into the city without much control of what happens on either side, right? And so you actually are talking about 5 different administrations and 5 different governments. And then the fact that none of them could actually sit across a table and work this out gives you the kind of chaos that you see today, right? So by the next bridge, the government had learned something better. They had worked out, the Fort Foundation actually led one of the major planning missions in India for about 10 years. There was something called the CMPO, Calcutta Metropolitan Planning Organization, which was funded by the Ford Foundation between 1963 and roughly 1975. And they had proposed a second bridge because clearly the first bridge was not sort of solving the story. And many of the jurisdictional issues that were to be sorted out, that had sort of emerged in the first bridge was sought to be addressed in the second one with a couple of very interesting twists. So one of the issues was in fact to retain the navigability of the Ganga. I speak to some economists and who have been very skeptical about the very idea that the Ganga should be kept navigable, given the tremendous amount of silt that sort of comes into the river from the Himalayas and sort of the downflow of the river. So nonetheless, huge costs were added to raise the bridge above a certain height. This is about 30 stories high. And one of the effects of that was that the bridge itself, in fact, flies over Howrah on the north side. And so therefore that makes Howrah a kind of city that lies underneath the bridge, but is not in fact benefited by the bridge, right? So this one links mostly to a national highway. So it sort of skips over all the local towns to the north. Again, to serve the interests of navigability, which one may consider is sort of a nonsense anyway, you actually kill the claims and the interests of the abutting property. So national interest over local interest. The other aspect, which is very fascinating, the bridge was designed by one of the most famous bridge designers in the world, Jörg Schleich, the German bridge designer. And he was giving a talk at Princeton, and it sort of one day, I usually always when I go to talks, sometimes I feel like doing that on my own talks. I usually go in the back, the last row, and fall asleep sometimes. But what made me sort of wake up was that he said, like, if there's one bridge that I want to be remembered for after I die, it would be this bridge. And the reasons why he gave the reasons he gave for this was really, really interesting. So it turned out that by the time all the feasibility studies, the budgets and everything had been worked out by the American Ford Foundation in agreement with the central government, by 1977, the CPM had come to power in Bengal. And the bridge was initially meant to be a welded structure. And the CPM insisted that the bridge be made into an employment generating project for the local population. So they forced the designer and the central government to convert the welded bridge to a riveted bridge so that thousands of people could be put to work riveting this bridge. Most economists who are basically followers of mainstream wall-raising economics would poo-poo this idea of employment generation, but I actually think that there is some value without the fact that it was the CPM that actually supported it. And those ideas have been carried through in more recent, this idea of that infrastructure should be employment generating, have been carried on later on in schemes such as Manrega, et cetera. So that's a kind of, again, a kind of begged question of who is the bridge for and who makes it and why, and who benefits from it, both in its construction, but also where does this infrastructure go? India today has ghost highways that nobody uses. The highway authorities of India stopped publishing or gathering data around 2014. The date itself is significant. You may guess why. Because they don't want to find out, who's using highways and who's not, and where the highways are being built. So that is another kind of story here. And the last bridge, which is, as I said, the new Dakshineshwar Bridge. So this is in fact no longer a public bridge. It's a private bridge. It belongs to Larsen and Toubro. And here the jurisdiction entirely becomes private. They own the bridge. They own all the land that to the east and west of the bridge until it reaches the highway. And they charge for you to use the bridge. So it's a private property, which is shown to be public infrastructure. So in this, you see the different fiscal histories of Indian government between the first Hara Bridge, the second Hara Bridge, and the third bridge, all of which in fact are very different governmental structures with very different fiscal arrangements, very different financial arrangements, and very different understandings of costs and benefits in terms of who actually uses the bridge, who pays for it, et cetera, and so on and so forth. I will just finish this little segment with one little slide that should tell you that which is the most popular of all these three choices. Okay, sorry. Oh, sorry. I think I erased that by, but I think you get a sense that you can see how empty this bridge is. This is the somewhat used. And then Hara Bridge continues to be used at the levels that it is, also because it's city center, but that's another story. Okay. Another little project that came out of this, and this is again, some of the issues were sort of addressed yesterday in the review, is this, is where this bridge sort of empties out. And this is the roughly the square mile that is today, that has been, that is known as Bada Bazar or Bora Bazar. The Bora Bazar is a massive, it's a 1 square mile of territory. It is a wholesale, retail, and logistical center for all of Eastern India. The amount of transactions here, based on sort of interviews I've conducted in this region, in this area, amounts to about $200 billion a year, which is, I mean, Amazon's global business, I think, is 500 billion, if I'm not wrong, or something like that. So, I mean, that's the kind of scale that one is talking about. And it is, I'm very interested in this kind of the remnants of the 19th century city, which is what Bora Bazar is. Bora Bazar, by the way, was the center of Indian economic commerce until the 1950s. This is an area where, this is a place where the Tagores have their house, but also some other names that you may recognize: the Birlas, the Bajajes, the Ruiyas, the Poddars. These massive industrial houses, all of them had their headquarters in this area. This is where Gandhi used to come, and he used to shuttle between the Birla mansion and the Tagore mansion. And this is where he raised funds for the Indian National Congress. Jamnalal Bajaj was his choice of treasurer for the Indian National Congress. So this was a place of tremendous wealth at a certain point, and continues to be, except it's a very densely packed market. Literally 1 million people work in it on any given day. There are reports that somebody made a study, because now currently cities are, you know, logistics is, there's this idea that logistics should be shipped out of city centers and be taken out to peripheries. So, in my view, that actually kills the city, because if there's one raison d'etre for the city, it is logistics and exchange. If you take out exchange and logistics from city centers, cities die. So it's sort of worth thinking about, you know, what is it that makes cities today? And I don't particularly have a very preservationist view on this. I'm much more interested in transactions. So the study found out that if you were to sort of rationalize and modernize the logistics operations that are carried out in this area, according to modern standards, like the way Amazon would do it, you would require 72 square miles of area, okay, to make that efficient. So this is also a place of high efficiency. And here, preservation is in fact a casualty, which is what makes me a lot more ambivalent about the uses and goods of preservation. So what happens is, why is Bora Bazar Bora Bazar? Is because rents are still stuck in the 1950s. So effectively, the rents are so low. There are people who are paying 100 rupees, 100, 200 rupees, 400 rupees for properties that are, you know, a few hundred square feet or 1,000 square feet. So because the rents are so low, you could think of this entire bazaar as effectively public space. In other words, what else is public space but the use of space which has no rent, right? And so Bora Bazar, you would think, should be dying, but in fact it is growing, where people are subdividing and subdividing and subdividing. So each building, which may be 4 floors, 5 floors, now each person, as they start a business, the business goes for a while, then fails, then you subdivide and sublease the rest of the property. So more people come in. And what happens in the process is that the buildings begin to crater because no particular owner has ownership over any given building. But the buildings are heavily used. So there's a conflict of interest between preservation per se and use here, and which is heavy economic use. So people are actually, deriving income from this territory. So we've tried to sort of look at the classic arguments for this in urban studies, what is known as clustering functions. Effectively, if you overlay multiple functions onto one piece of economic territory, there are sort of externalities in terms of labor benefits, other benefits that sort of accrue to all of the businesses. So, this is classic public space argument, a public goods argument. So, if you think about wholesale markets, you often might wonder that why are all the plastic sellers all in one place? I mean, you would think that going by traditional theories of mainstream economics, it would make sense for them to be in different parts so that, they can compete against each other more successfully. But actually the reverse is true. Being near each other means that more people, there'll be more footprints on a given territory, so that each of them, in fact, the gains for each of them are higher than being in a much more scattered environment. In fact, the people who know these best are, in fact, Amazon, because that's Amazon, you could think, is this massive aggregative enterprise that precisely does exactly that. So, in Calcutta, if you want to go buy plastic buckets, you just of a particular kind, and you don't want to walk, travel all across the city trying to find the particular plastic bucket, it makes sense for you simply to go to Bada Bazaar. The same reason why you go to Amazon, right? So those are the kind of external externalities and public benefits that accrue from these kind of aggregations, clustering, co-location that Bada Bazaar actually presents. And so there's an economic case as to why logistics in Bada Bazaar is in fact very successful, and even today, and the proof of that is that more and more people are in fact coming into Bada Bazaar to transact business. So this is not a city that is dying, even if its buildings are. Economic activity keeps growing, but that doesn't mean that. So this is some of the we've done a bunch of studies here. The roads are completely during daytime because trucks have curfew. They can't travel across the city during daytime. The trucks use up all the streets. So each truck, for instance, is going to a different location. You can see that there's not just one class of good. It's like different people put different goods on the same truck. So they become just-in-time exchange locations during the daytime, and all of the road is completely occupied by trucks during the daytime. So the trucks, in fact, become an extension of the warehouses and the shops during the daytime. And by nighttime, this truck will have been filled up all the way up to here. You can see this happening. So this is if any of us are modernizers and modern city planners and we are interested in modern architecture, this is the absolute antithesis of what we call good urbanism, right? But that is simply our, on some level, what I'm trying to understand here is how that is simply a kind of bias that we have towards open spaces, for instance. I'm not saying open spaces are bad, but it depends, and one needs to think about those things. Certainly these people would say that they would benefit from some open space. I should note that nobody in Bada Bazaar, I've interviewed any number of union people, I've interviewed shopkeepers, I've interviewed the mafia here. Mafia controls the entire, different kinds of mafia controls all these operations, so that not, in these millions of transactions conducted every day, not a single bag will go missing on a given day. So there's a huge security component here. None of them say they like Bada Bazaar, so they don't actually have any investment. If you ask them, like, they would love contemporary logistical spaces much better. But they also understand that should they shift to the new system, they will completely lose out from what the gains are in this current system. So that is a kind of predicament, if you like. There's no nostalgia. There's no saying like, oh, things were beautiful yesterday and they're beautiful now, and but there's a real interest in preserving things as they are, as opposed to a kind of modernized logistics and urban framework. So the big question is, who benefits from that kind of modernization? I was shocked yesterday to hear the Shahpur report. Many of you who are from Ahmedabad, I grew up in Ahmedabad, will remember that Relief Road and all of these Teen Darwaja, and I've seen this happen, where the busiest areas of Ahmedabad, it took sometimes an hour to get from Ellis Bridge to the station. And now you can make it in 15 minutes because the business has just moved elsewhere. So that's the kind of fate that is still to be decided in Calcutta's case and is worth thinking about. We've done sort of time studies. This is a very interesting case. So it's not only, there's so much lack of space that even when a truck is parked, as I said, during the daytime, somebody sets up a shop under the truck to sell their wares. And within 4 hours, this guy's stuff is sold and he moves away and it's done. So an urbanization of high density, thinking about what benefits comes from that. This is one of the mafia people that I was talking about. The workers just, because it's just in time, the trucks might arrive at any moment. They're all from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. They sleep right there in the market. And then whenever the truck comes, they get up and start loading or unloading. We've done all kinds of, network studies of where goods travel, warehouses, buildings and their use. This is Posta, which is the big vegetable market. We sort of mapped, just to give you some nice architectural images. As I'm saying, the architecture in some level is irrelevant. What is much more important is how much space is afforded in a given room and how it can be packed up. And then, since I'm a historian, I mean, how do these jurisdictional ownership conflicts play out? So I'm looking at court cases about space, about leases, litigation that's sort of playing out over these buildings as a way of understanding the dynamics of and the tensions of how space is occupied in this territory. Okay, I'll just close off by, so that understanding as a teacher has sort of made me think about what to teach and how to teach. So I've offered with partnering with various people. So in the last, in fact, this spring, we did a studio on the jute mills of Kolkata, and that's the jute mills themselves are a sort of related story. Of course, the Birlas and all of these people made their money initially from jute. But precisely bringing these kinds of dynamics and thinking about interests and stakes as the primary attribute to bring into design studios. So making a nice space. I mean, we work with graduate students, so that we don't have to worry about, their design training, etc. They're all already well trained. But then what we were trying to do is bring this kind of transactional character and interested formats of space holding into front and center. So, one of the biggest tools of emptying cities, in fact, for the 20th century, and this is a very American device, is the device of zoning. Zoning is always a way of kicking people out. That's what zoning is for. So what do you do? What did it mean to be a kind of anti-zoning advocate? Like, what if cities had no zones? Like you could have a shop next to your house, next to a storage space, next to something else, next to a factory, next to something else. Environmental concerns aside, I mean, sort of, what if we densify cities instead of cities are densifying anyway, but what if you take that as a positive attribute? So this is a very interesting, one of the students, this is a group of students who did a very interesting proposition where basically they said, like, we're not going to worry about the architecture itself. We're going to assume that this is going to be maxed out in terms of FSI. So what is left to the architects is in fact the negative spaces. What is not, what you cannot build on and operates as public space. So you cannot actually distinguish the boundaries of their site, which is roughly this, from the surrounding existing areas. So on some level, they just assume that rather than making nice new architecture, this architecture will somewhat look like that, only more hyper-densified. What you're going to do is create, infrastructure where infrastructure becomes the negative of architecture, where you cannot build and which is kept as a kind of public good that is shared by whatever comes up in the future. So that becomes the more highly defined area rather than the buildings themselves. Again, these are just students responding to a brief. This one was a very interesting, I talked about the politics of dredging. This this couple of students, in fact, said, like, instead of the central government dredging and giving these big contracts to Mr. Adani's companies to dredge the river up and down, what if this was decentralized and each piece of land, as I pointed out, that the bank of the Ganga is in fact conflicted territory. The transportation ministry has a hold over the river because it has to open up transportation up and down the river. There's the environment ministry, there's the Ganga ministry, there's the port trust, then there are the abutting municipalities, then the greater Kolkata metropolitan area. So in some ways, this conflict, that the fact that nobody knows who owns land and what they should be controlling could be an opportunity. So if you allow for small enough operators to sort of start up little businesses by simply, this goes back to the silting film that I showed you, to sort of carry on silting operations in a decentralized way that could possibly go up and down the river, such that the benefits of desilting is distributed across a greater population. And that might be one way of thinking about it. And it has precisely, if you keep it small, it can exploit these jurisdictional tensions and sort of, so that's a kind of, I should point out that these students picked on Gaganendranath Tagore's views of the Hooghly and the Ganga to sort of do their renderings, which is sort of really nice, fabulous. And the last one is, this is a studio that I taught at Columbia, also in Kolkata, where I asked the students in the first month to do a master plan of the city, and the students had never been to Kolkata. But through my lab, I've gathered huge amounts of data on pretty much every neighborhood. We have a pretty good sense of what goes on in every corner. And given them that level of data, the real job was how to process data very quickly, like you were a McKinsey trying to answer a project brief in 1 month, which is typically the amount of time that the Indian government will give you to cook up a master plan. In fact, the Central Vista Authority was given 1 week, or something like that, even more ridiculous. But what can you do in 1 month in terms of coming up with ideas? Now, this was a very interesting story here. So the students from Columbia had not been to Kolkata ever, but one of the students fixated on transportation corridors and BRT systems. That's what he wanted to do. And he ended up drawing this section based on what he saw from Google Earth, etc. And then when we went there in the middle of the semester, we were going under a skyscraper, under a flyover, and the student asked, "Where are we?" And I was like, "In the Park Circus, I think we're in the Park Circus area." And he said, like, "Yes, I know, because I drew it this way." So in a way, sort of familiarity and knowledge, it's a big question as to what is knowledge, what is data, what is familiarity, who is an interested group in that situation. I mean, sometimes from a distance, if you work at the data more carefully, you can come to certain understandings of a site that even local people don't have, which is not to dissuade the idea of local input, but but in fact ask for greater expertise on the side of the professional. And we allow for some jokes. So I leave you with this image of preservation. So the downtown Kolkata, as I said, is all the buildings are cratering, but there's a lot of historical I mean, all of it is 19th century buildings. That is Bara Bazaar, right? And all of these buildings are cratering. So one of the students, this is a Columbia Chinese student, he's like, many of these buildings are landmarked, which makes it worse. Gurmeet pointed to this earlier. It's a tax on the owner. When you landmark a building, it means that the owner can't do anything. Therefore, these buildings then fall apart. So what is it that we are preserving? Are we preserving a look so that the tourists come and the rich who want to build skyscrapers nearby think like they have a historical center that they can go to? Or is it the actual brick itself that is being preserved? And obviously the answer, broadly speaking, of preservation is to say the former, which is to say that what we are usually protecting is an ambience, a look. So this guy came up with the idea, like, what if we introduce a preservation industry in the center of Calcutta, where many of these micro industries can start to produce preservation parts, like an entablature or a column capital or something like that, that itself becomes, since along with globalization, preservation is one of the big economic features of globalization. Every place is now fighting for preservation of some kind. And so you could see preservation itself as a globalized movement in the global economy. So why not look at preservation as an economics in itself? And so you could set up these manufactories where artisans and workers who, I mean, this is actually the neighborhood of Kumartuli, which some of you may be familiar with. They build these statues for Durga Puja, etc. So there's a massive number of artisans in this area. So while they only produce for Kali Puja and Durga Puja, for the rest of the year, they could build architectural parts that can supply the rebuilding of Calcutta itself. But beyond it, why not Venice, so that preservation becomes an export industry? Like if a capital in Venice has to be replaced, they can send you a digital drawing and you can produce it in Calcutta and ship it to them by FedEx, etc. Anyway, slightly humorous, slightly funny, but sort of worth thinking about. And so basically these large cranes take up these building parts and move them to the to little barges waiting on the river. And so you think of preservation as this kind of systematized enterprise. I'll stop there. There's a lot of stuff to gather, but I have to stop sharing, I guess. Okay, all right.
Thank you for an amazing talk. And so there is a question that we would directly start with. We have some technical issues with Gurmeet ma'am. She is not available currently. But I think this one, oh, she's here. Great. So this one can be answered by either of you. You mentioned, this is for Gurmeet ma'am, you mentioned how we need to carry forward our cultural heritage of a community. Post-independence, there were two aspects in architecture, one by Gandhi, which was Swadeshi, while the other was Nehru, who promoted modernism. So was Nehru's approach questionable?
A difficult one. No, I don't agree with that. I mean, I don't think any particular moment in time is questionable. It all contributes to the narrative. The point is, when you are looking today and you're looking back, or how communities perceive their heritage is the way they experience a space. It in a particular given time. So it's like, I was working on a particular site in Chennai, and it's a site of megalithic cis. And the site was evaluated in the 1950s as not of significance because it was destroyed in this whole course of, significantly destroyed in the course of laying a railroad. But for some reason did not get denotified. And after that, on adjacent to it, the Standard Motors put a factory and so on and so forth. So today I was asked to go and do a heritage impact assessment of this particular site, which had not got denotified, an ancient site with Standard Motors on, remnants of the factory and so on. Now, for me, even to look at the history of the 1950s or the 1960s is a history of modern India. So you do not do a value judgment as an individual who's there as a practitioner or as an academician or so on. You actually look at that entire narrative holistically and then see what is it saying to you about a particular time, a particular period, and in the context that you're examining that particular site. So we are not here to do a value judgment that this was right and this was wrong. It's only when we have to do a management plan that you have to define the statement of significance and then identify the attributes that represent that particular statement of significance and therefore respond to it. And when you respond, it does not mean you've got to do like for like. You could interpret that for the community or for the people that you're actually, managing that or preparing the management plan for. So I don't see a problem. I don't see a contradiction here.
Also, the contradiction is not true. So that characterization of Gandhi and Nehru is in fact completely incorrect. Gandhi was actually anti-urban on many levels, and so he would not have been happy with architects, period. Forget about modern or any kind, right? I mean, so there's some very fascinating letters between him and Patrick Geddes, the Scottish planner who lived in India, so the Swadeshi part of Gandhi applied to a lot of things, and those are interesting, but his views on architecture are almost practically absent. On the other hand, in the case of Nehru, I mean, yes, he's been, of course, Chandigarh and New Delhi and the Mandi House Circle and Gropius and, the Bauhaus students, etc. But he was also fairly neutral. I mean, if you look at his comments on Bhubaneswar, which was basically copied a temple architecture, he was incredibly, and his view, I mean, the seminar on architecture, which was had in 1959 in Delhi, his view was that the government should not have strong views on what kind of architecture there should be. So, and he was the one to resist it. In fact, the architects were all for like, let us do modern architecture. And he was like, no, the state cannot mandate a style. So this is an association that, I mean, obviously in the current environment, this is always made that, all faults belong to Nehru, but sometimes you blame people for something that they've not done.
Okay, so the second question is to Arindam. While the rent remains low and the bazaar, Bara Bazaar is a public space essentially because of that, it is causing bigger issues of density, which will be irreversible. So how does one intervene and still make sure all stakeholders are fairly negotiated with?
It's a very good question, but fairness is a big question in almost any city that you have, right? I mean, any kind of territory that you have. Cities, broadly speaking, are unequal political territories and economic territories. Cities are created to, in fact, formalize inequality. If you look at a city like Bombay, where the world's practically the richest person in the world lives and the world's poorest person also lives within a few miles of each other, cities always congregate inequalities, right? So the question of what is fair and what is unfair, what is unequal is a very good one, but we have to be very careful to not simply associate that with open space, right? what do these people need? Maybe they need healthcare more than they need nice spaces, or they need bathrooms, which is a huge premium, right? So we have to think about the terms of what is it that we are construing as fair or unfair, where the state should intervene, right? I mean, should the state intervene to blow away this bazaar and, have a big something in its place? Or should that actually operate out of the intelligence of how this market actually works and what it needs, given that it's so successful? Maybe some of it needs to even move away. I mean, nobody's asking to preserve this thing as is. In fact, the people who are there are the last people to say that. So we have to honor that as well, that they would rather be somewhere else. But the only argument I'm making is that there is a greater economic equality perhaps that exists in the situation as opposed to a much more scattered territorial reach that, for instance, where the largest amount of infrastructure money today is going from the West Bengal government is to these new townships. This is not atypical in Kolkata, everywhere. That's where the money goes. So effectively, and this goes back to my story of the Ganga versus the rest of India, is that where there's greatest need, there's the lowest infrastructure, and where there is new properties, new townships, where you can actually, political parties can gather rent from land sequestration, infrastructure building, highways, cement. That's where all the state money goes. And since here there's so many poor people working, you cannot build that up into a kind of claim for infrastructure. And that's what I'm interested in.
Gurmeet ma'am, because you have worked on a very similar, not as similar, but at least a property of the space that you've worked with, the market outside Golden Temple. Would you agree with what he's saying in terms of how should it be dealt with?
He's trying to make us fight.
Yeah. A difficult one. A difficult one because I have, when I look at the city, I don't know, I probably look at it, my fingers are on a different pulse. So when I look at the city of Amritsar, the scale is very different. The character of the city is very different. Though Amritsar became a very important commercial center, it was on this very, very important road connecting Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, on the Grand Trunk Road. And then, of course, it's on the trade route to Kashmir. So it's been a very, very important center. Tea trade, Calcutta bringing it to Amritsar, and that being the center for further, for carrying the goods to other places. Now, the point is that and the city is small, it's about 1.5 kilometers across in one direction, about less than 2 kilometers on the north-south axis, on a very pedestrian scale, very intimate. The neighborhood planning was very different, called the Katras. And within the Katras, it wasn't like sector, it was almost like when you look at the Chandigarh sector, that you had commercial streets cutting across these neighborhoods, which was a principal commercial street, and then you had the secondary streets, which were residential areas. And that's how these katras were under different chieftains and different communities and so on. Now, the road leading up to Harmandir Sahib had a very, very different character, because I do believe that your walk to a site of pilgrimage evokes a certain experience. It's like when you look at the master plan of Kenzo Tange for Lumbini. It's that walk that going up to the archaeological site, the place of the birth of Lord Buddha, what it does to you when you walk through nature. Similarly, the traffic needs to be calmed. You need to calm down before you enter a sacred space like that. What has happened with the current intervention is that while they've been able to keep the traffic out, they've done the traffic calming, they've actually done the embellishments on facades of buildings which are completely fake. It's a vocabulary from another part of the country. That is a smaller issue. But the point is they've trivialized it. They've made it into some strange recreational mood into that space that it detracts from the essence of that central site. There are other places in Amritsar that could have been this, heritage street and all that, entertainment and so on. This could have been treated very, very differently in a more meaningful and deeper understanding of values, because it's not based on principles of equity. It's not, what it has done is it's brought the elite. You've got the subways and you've got the McDonald's and all that, all in their, ethnic colors, painted over with ethnic colors, which is on these particular roads. And some decorated, some idea of heritage where certain crafts have been, or certain shops have been kind of branded in a particular way through the street. But it doesn't do any good to the artisans of Amritsar. It doesn't expand the fact that 100,000 people come to Harmandir Sahib every day. It doesn't spread the benefit of, the possibilities of trade and wealth generation to the larger walled city of Amritsar. So it's compromised the principles while it has done some sort of decorative embellishment on this particular road. So the process and the means to the end is as important as the end itself. And that's what this particular intervention has compromised in the case of Amritsar.
Yeah, I would say that, the reason I'm not a preservation architect, and I'm not invested in preservation in the same way that Gurmeet is. I tend to be sort of admittedly a little skeptical of the aims of preservation, but respecting what preservation architects have to say. So my interest in looking at Bara Bazar was exactly there are areas in Calcutta which sort of could be seen as candidates for preservation in the way that Gurmeet is looking at the Harmandir Sahib, major institutional foci that in itself call attention to themselves from a larger national, international, and local standpoint. My interest in Bara Bazar was therefore exactly the opposite. Nobody's interested in Bara Bazar. If you ask any elite in Calcutta, they would happily say, oh, that place needs to go. Right? So, and so even many of the people in Bara Bazar, so there's no nostalgia for this place, right? So then the big question is, why is it so successful? And what are the elements that make it so successful? And this has to do with the entire economy of the eastern region of India. Those dense populations. So many of these goods are in fact traveling for, up to the Ganga, the various parts of the Gangetic region, to Assam, to Southeast Asia. There's a whole regional economy that's sort of located in this 1 square mile. So I am much more sort of, I guess on many levels, I'm asking the question, what is there to preserve? What should we preserve? And that's an open question. I'm not wedded to that this is the nice part. Let's leave that, because there are no vested interests in any, but that's what I'm trying to figure out through my research. What I do know is that this city, that part of the city, functions better than almost any other territory in India today, in terms of sheer efficiencies. Yeah. So on some level, the Amazons and the Flipkarts and these companies are sort of salivating to grab some of that business for themselves.
On a very similar line, there is another question. Is there a difference between the perception of a monument and the perception of heritage with respect to the current global debate of counter monuments? So, I think it can apply to
global debate on.
Somebody has to explain what a counter monument is. I can guess, but can you be clearer?
About the perception of heritage. Just a second, keeps on. I'm sorry. The perception of heritage with respect to the current global debate of counter monuments. I think, I don't know, I'm just speaking.
to explain because I don't know this word.
It's anonymous, but
A counterperson, a counterperson.
I think we can talk
No,
about the
but
monuments that are
does this
being put
person,
up in our country.
is it simply the question of, I mean, Gurmeet is better prepared to answer, but I'm trying to understand the question. Is it simply the fact that we don't privilege the building as a pure object in itself, and we're looking at the populations around it, and that should be part of preservation as well, which is sort of the, is that what counter monument is?
I think
Counter
they're just sorry. I think they're just asking about the difference between a monument and a heritage, a perceived monument and a perceived heritage, and what is its stance in the current counter monument. Or I'm just because it's anonymous, I'm just trying to understand. It could be the current situation of a government trying to create monuments on their own, maybe, which act as a counter monument of the existing monuments which they do not agree with. Okay, I think we can move on from this question. So according to you, the cities with lesser affluent class have the least possible chance to get developed, urbanized, industrialized. If that is the case, how do you think the equality in equal of public spaces in so-called developed modern city can be achieved?
I think the dynamics are in fact the same. So what I pointed to as a jurisdictional conflict is as true in the areas that are quote unquote urbanizing faster than as they are in the Gangetic area. So, but what is equally begged there, therefore, is the question of public space, right? If the areas that are urbanizing faster, I would argue are doing so because they're because of certain ways in which wealth travels, and actually farming populations are key to this, middle farmer populations, that they're able to convert agrarian land and club it to build, to sort of transform it into real estate in a much more successful way. But what these territories are then doing is internalizing public space within the townships rather than making public space. But that doesn't mean that public space would not be created, because a government might decide that in order to attract real estate money into a region, we need to create public space, right? You create a park so that there'll be more towers nearby, etc. So even public space seen outside of that politics is also a non sequitur. Public space can be created by private interests. I mean, the classic example in New York is Central Park, right? It was entirely paid for by abutting real estate properties. So in some ways, Central Park is actually policed by a group of well-to-do, well-heeled money men of New York who pretty much decide what goes on in Central Park, right? So you could take Ahmedabad's Sabarmati riverfront as a similar example, where it is real estate that is, and the claims on public finances that aggregated real estate can make, that actually makes this quote unquote public space that, unlike Central Park, has no public transport coming there. So most people can't actually use it except those who have their buildings facing the river, right? So in itself, these are not contradictions. You have to look at how the operations of, investment interest groups actually realize their interest in creation of different spaces.
In terms of this question, I would say, it's not the scale, it's not the monumental scale that defines whether something becomes heritage. It's about, heritage has to stand the test of time. For anything to be called heritage is something which has to stand the test of time. Heritage, like they say that history gets written and rewritten, and it's the victors who write it. And it's primarily been, this is something which UNESCO has been saying, that the kind of heritage sites that have come even on World Heritage are the ones that represent, for the longest, that represent the history of either princes or politicians or priests. It's a story of the common person which gets missed out in these narratives. And there are lots of missing people in these narratives. So in terms of monument, anti-monument, or whatever that word was, I mean, today I'm involved in the conservation, retrofitting, revitalization of a silk factory in Srinagar. And it's industrial heritage, but the last thing that I'm really, I mean, while I am enjoying looking at the technology and the architectures and thing, but for me, the questions that I'm dealing with right now in my practice is that what does it mean to people today? And what can it mean to people tomorrow? And therefore, what processes are necessary or need to be enabled? Like, I'm not doing a value judgment here. I may not be using the right words here, because as a practitioner, I would say, okay, what processes need to be enabled for the legacy of that, and that the legacy of silk for the Kashmir Valley is tremendous. It actually is a symbol of the Silk Road. And the Silk Road of yesterday was the internet of today. So when you're doing a silk factory, you're looking at it in terms of the continuum. You're not just holding on to the factory as a building or technology or the product. So it's in fact one of my most challenging projects now, because I'm looking at the technology, the product, the people, the past, the Silk Road, and what does it mean to people today and into the future. So I think as academicians or practitioners, like yesterday, what Professor Chaya was saying, that what are you doing today that actually sets some new thinking going for tomorrow? And I think that was a huge takeaway for me. And in fact, it was parallel to another comment that I got as an advice from Professor Oberoi, who's a very well-known sociologist in Delhi, because several years ago, I was restoring a mosque being looked after by the Nihang Sikhs. And what Professor Oberoi said, he said, what you do should be relevant for the next 1,000 years. And I was wondering, what is he trying to tell me? I'm going to fix a monument which is 400 or 300 years old, brick and lime. How is it going to be relevant for 1,000 years? And what he actually meant was that irrespective of whether the building stays or not, the principles that inform your process and what you do should be timeless. And that's what makes heritage. So I guess it goes into, it's a question you pose to yourself when you're engaging with a particular site at a given time. And what processes emerge in terms of you that you follow to be able to find the solutions as well. So you have to find your own answers to your questions.
So it's, I think it's again for Gurmeet ma'am. So one observes that the religious place have certain traditions that are followed. So how is the evolution of these traditions affected by the architecture? Or more like, is it possible that certain traditions have evolved and due to which the architecture around it has also changed over the years? Is there a role of conservation architect in it?
See, in the case of the Golden Temple, the biggest challenge for us as practitioners were to develop a conservation plan. And then I revisited the site to make the conservation plan. Now, I will give you the point of views of different people who were engaged. Now, there was, from the technical aspect, there was a very well-known art conservator Jagat Vijay Surya from Sri Lanka, who had worked on the conservation of the Temple of the Tooth Relic after the bombing. What he questioned was that the act of renewal of surfaces, wall paintings, you know, let's begin with the surfaces, has happened several times. What are we thinking about in terms of continuing the tradition of embellishments? Because embellishments is an act of faith as well, whether you see it in the Hindu temples or Buddhism or in Islamic architecture and even in Sikhism, that embellishments, or in the Bhakti Sufi thing, this whole thing of this discipline of repetition of a craft, a skill, has been the ways of the very evolved people, you know, the saints of the Bhakti tradition. Each one of them had a craft. So for him, it was that, okay, what is Punjab doing or Amritsar doing or SGPC doing in keeping up with training people in the skill of wall paintings? That was his question. As far as I'm concerned, when I was having a dialogue with a material scientist, their question was in terms of compatibility, that the building is built with brick and lime. What are the principles they're going to follow in terms of renewal, where the materiality is, the choices of material is compatibility, scientific compatibility. Because the moment you apply cement on a lime material, there are going to be issues. The monument is standing in the middle of water. There's going to be rising damp. Is the cement going to allow the water to dry? Cement has sulfates. Is it good for the inherent building material? If it is not compatible, then that material should not be selected. Now, that's a perspective of a material scientist. Coming to the perspective of the community, in the entire tradition of the Golden Temple, state patronage was not acceptable. From the times of the founding fathers to Maharaja Ranjit Singh, to the setting up of the SGPC, which is the mini parliament of the Sikhs, where the community offers through seva wealth to the site, any kind of practice in terms of maintenance of the site has to use the monies of the community, contributed by the community, and none of it should be done through state patronage. To an extent that after the Operation Blue Star, when the government tried to restore the Akal Takht, the community actually brought it down to reconstruct with the community resources. So when it comes to making of the conservation plan by a conservation architect, you may be the person who's putting it all together. There are multiple threads, streams that come your way for you to define. So then if I were to look at what has the conservation world contributed to this understanding, I'll draw your attention to two doctrinal texts. One is the Bara Charter, done by the Australians, where they say value-based planning, that you determine the values, and the values could be scientific, social, economic, cultural, whatever, and you identify the attributes to be able to do a conservation plan. And the other is the Nara document of authenticity, which the Japanese came out with, because when they restore the timber temples, as long as they believe that timber tends to decay, and it does decay. So when they have to restore the temple, they bring it apart and they put it together. As long as their architectural principles, their processes, their joinery, all that is consistent, and I'm sure there are many other aspects as well, that defines that whole process and detailing and defines their authenticity. So when it comes to preparing a conservation plan, not just for the Golden Temple, but any site which is important for a group of people or a community, you've got to understand what's significant for them to be able to then arrive at an architectural, scientific, technological solution. Yeah.
This is the last question for today. We have tried to answer almost all the questions that have been put up. So it's from YouTube. How can we look at the how can we look at access to basic infrastructure for largely migrant population in urban?
Sorry, Arindam, I think we lost you. You just froze for a minute. Can you repeat?
Sorry. Okay. How can we look at access to basic infrastructure for largely migrant populations in urban cities? How do we understand the conception of belonging and access to infra for migrants who do not have access of entitlement?
Um, I'll say this, that is exactly where we need to pay our attention to if we're looking at cities today. The reason why infrastructure doesn't get built by migrants, for migrants, is that they're not a constituency. So if there is a huge amount of Biharis in Calcutta or Mumbai, they go and vote back in Bihar. So the local administration actually has, I'm always interested in institutions. Why should an institution do it in the first place? If you solve that, then they will do what is needed to be done. It's not like so that's really where the attention has to be addressed. And what is interesting in the case of Calcutta, I think is very fascinating in that light, as opposed to cities like Mumbai or Delhi. Calcutta is slowly inching towards the point where more than 50% of its population is under the poverty line. When that happens, any contemporary political party can actually keep winning elections by just addressing infrastructure for the poor rather than for the rich. That skews the political balance in a different way. But I think it, but that's one part of the story. If you were to think about real propositions, right, about how to sort of afford certain infrastructural benefits, I think we will have to, getting rid of zoning is a key thing, because what migrants do is they live in the interstices of zoning paradigms. So they occupy, pieces of territory within the city that are not surveilled, or let's say a real estate person is powerful, and has a certain hook into the ruling party at a given time. So they make sure that the migrants can live nearby in some estate, because that gives them access to, the site very, sort of a proximity to the site becomes critical. So if you actually, and there have been studies done on this, is that if you look at migrants' use of public infrastructure, for instance, buses, metros, they don't use it. They rather move to the work site, and when the work is over, they move to another site. So there's a migratory pattern within the city itself, based on how economies are sort of distributed around and when projects come up and so on and so forth. So then building a lot of heavy infrastructure, again, this goes back to the Ahmedabad metro station. If you actually price it, most people who we are talking about in this will not be able to use the metro, because they can't afford it. There's tour of Delhi, tour of other things. So we have to then look at the monetary aspect. What can a migrant pay for, right? Where can certain kinds of contracts be forged between the people who employ the migrants, the government itself, and it may mean actually thinking out of the box. Can you actually think of dormitory structures? The idea that we had, and this was played out in a train station, is that if you can rent space by the hour or by the day or by the month, rather than forcing people to have permanent leases of 11 months or 2 years, etc., like you do with parking. With car parking, you can park a car in a certain piece of land for 3 hours, and then you move off. So is there a way of supplying infrastructure that can monetize temporary occupancies, inhabitations, etc.? Can we think about this? And the paradigm for this, oddly enough, is logistics. That's what happens with goods. If that's why a good sits in a warehouse for a day, then gets moved on a truck, and so on and so forth. If you can start understanding cities as part of these processes and try and, in fact, create capital investments that may be profitable even for somebody, to actually address those patterns of settlement, of how migrants move, how migrants travel, that would be a start. But you have to take a very good, hard look at what is actually going on, rather than, and sort of try and answer that, and then find people who are willing to engage these issues in the local administration, right? My suspicion is that migratory politics is going to become a lot more significant in the coming decades in India.
Okay, so are there any closing statements that you would want to say? Because this was the last question that we have. Anything? Okay. Yeah.
So thank you very much. And it's been wonderful 2 days. And I look forward to the other sessions in the next for the next 5 days, I think. So it's been great. You guys have been wonderful.
Thank you.
Same here. Thank you for inviting me. That's all right. Good to be back at SET.
On the end note, thank you all for joining us today. It was indeed a very thought-provoking and insightful discussion. We are sure these conversations are going to stay with us and help us think about our practices in future very critically. I would like to thank everyone on behalf of KVDF team for joining us today on Zoom as well as YouTube. Do join us tomorrow from 7 p.m. onwards for another curated discussion on our second sub-theme, which is human-human. Visit our website for all the information for further schedules and details. Also, stay tuned on Instagram and Facebook, and stay safe and stay healthy. And thank you all for joining. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.